Yeah, sure. Good afternoon. When the economy is moving at 9.2%, you don't have much time for words, it's time for action, so I'll make this quick. Our subject today is politics overtaking the economy? It's a counterfactual question because there can't be economics without politics, because economics is all about people and how dividends reach people. On November 9, 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, many thought it was a turning point in history. Some even said it was the end of history. Capitalism, they declared, had come to win the battle over communism. Some said it was the victory of market forces. The others felt there was only one ideology for the world to follow. 15 years later, we are now told that the four fastest growing economies are Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Brazil is ruled by trade unionist Luiz Lula da Silva and his Workers' Party. Russia is run by the former KGB chief. China, we all know, is run by the Communist Party. And India, by all admissions, and Mr. Chidambaram might testify to this or he may protest about this, is held back, if not run by the left front. Now, those who wrote the epitaph of communism are wondering, how on earth did we get here? Actually, it's not an uncommon situation. In 1855, the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold wrote, "We are wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born." You could look at it in a global context. You could look at it in a domestic context. You drive out of Delhi a few hours and you know you're traveling from one world to another. It's so in many parts of the country. You might also wonder how come a country which is growing so fast, which has such a large middle class, is electing a record 60 members of parliament from the left front. You would also wonder, why did the NDA lose the election despite high growth and India shining? The wonder of wonders really this year is how come this government didn't celebrate the record 9.2% GDP growth? The answer is really politics. Somewhere in the 90s, the absolutism of market forces seemed to make way for the left. Critical to this debate is really the rising inequality in society. Unfortunately, commentators and some politicians seem to confuse the cause of inequality as a consequence of growth. The lopsided debate over inflation and the blame apportioned to high growth is one symptom of this. Sure, growth does heighten inequality, but is state expansionism the answer? I'm just raising some points, Mr. Finance Minister. Are doles called job guarantees the answer, or is opening up the economy the right way the answer? Can higher outlays, expenditure deliver the outcome of inclusive growth? Some people feel, is Robin Hood economics, where a few taxpayers bear the rising burden of expenditure, the answer? The answer, it would seem, is clearly less government and more reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, there are very few people in this country as qualified as Finance Minister P. Chidambaram to answer this critical question. And I'm not saying this because he's an eminent lawyer. He can argue on any side of the brief. The question that we are addressing today is politics overtaking the economy. And why I'm saying he's the best placed person is because of his record. In 1997, as Finance Minister, he dismantled a high tax regime and delivered the dream budget. In 2005 and 6, he delivered 9% GDP growth. On the back of this 9% GDP growth this year, he has delivered 9.2% GDP growth. Despite coalitions, despite the left. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Finance Minister P. Chidambaram.
I'm grateful to Mr. Shankaraya for introducing me as one with the capacity to argue either side of the brief. It takes a thief to catch a thief. Thank you, Shankar. It's a provocative subject. Is politics overtaking the new economy? There are, of course, underlying assumptions, and I think one must be explicit about what one is talking about. What is the new economy? In my view, the new economy for which the doors were opened in 1991 is based on a few fundamental postulates. Firstly, an open and competitive economy. Secondly, adherence to fiscal prudence. Thirdly, promotion of investment in every sector and from as many sources as possible. Fourthly, growth that creates employment opportunities. Fifthly, a growth which is inclusive and embraces all sections of society. There are, of course, some other elements, but I do not wish to make it a very long list. Suffice for my purpose today to emphasize the need for an open and competitive economy, adherence to fiscal prudence, job-creating growth, inclusive growth, and promotion of investment. And of course, many believe that 9% growth and 9.2% growth is despite government. And I wish good luck to those who believe that, and we could experiment with 6 months of no government. There are countries in the neighborhood with no governments, or no effective governments, or no functional governments, and they don't record growth rates of 9 and 9.2%. I think government is central to growth, governance is central to growth, and therefore it would not be wise, I submit, to dismiss government and to dismiss the role of government. Having defined the new economy, we have now to define politics. And what is politics? In my view, the current politics is determined by the following. Firstly, the rise of regional parties. Secondly, a coalition government at the center. Thirdly, the dysfunction that seems to characterize lawmaking by parliament. Fourthly, the effectiveness of otherwise of executive and regulatory action. And finally, the role of the media. I think today's politics is determined by these 5 factors. Of course, there are many other factors which impact politics, but I think these are central to today's politics. So let me deal with each one of them and quickly come to the subject. There's no gainsaying the fact that regional parties have gained much greater voice in today's politics than ever before. And in a sense, the left parties are also regional parties. They have, of course, a national outlook and a national footprint, but they are also driven by concerns which emanate from regions or states where they have a very strong presence. A coalition government in the center is indeed led by, today by the Congress and until 2 years ago by the BJP, which are both national parties with national footprint, but there's a very dominant presence of regional parties. Many of these regional parties are not wedded to any ideology. Many of them can shift from one coalition to another. What is the common characteristics of all regional parties is they are very strongly driven by state interest or regional interest. In most cases, the interest of the state in which they have roots and which they have sway. The second determining factor of today's politics follows from the first, coalition. I believe coalitions are unavoidable, at least for the foreseeable future. In fact, you will find more and more coalition governments, not only the center, but also in the states. People are unwilling to trust absolute power to any one political party. Therefore, the politics of coalition must be understood, and we must be able to work the politics of coalitions. Thirdly, the dysfunctional role of Parliament. Parliament's essential role is to make law. But Parliament makes few laws these days. And the few laws that it makes amidst chaos. The appropriation bill is passed without debate. The vote on account is taken without debate. An amendment to the banking laws was made without debate. One of the most far-reaching tax reforms, in fact, the most far-reaching tax reforms undertaken in 80 years, the phase-out of CST, was done without any debate. The dysfunctional status of Parliament is something we should worry about. Then what is the role of Parliament? If it doesn't make legislation, if it doesn't debate legislation, if it doesn't deliberate upon laws, then what is the role of Parliament? Is Parliament merely becoming a debating society? And a debate which takes place amidst din and bustle, and the product is more noise than light. Contrast that with the role of executive and regulatory agencies. Executive policy making and regulatory policy making seem to be unfettered today. Only a couple of days ago, SEBI announced a series of important reform measures which are driven by a regulatory agency. Likewise, on the executive side, we take a number of steps for which we do not require parliamentary sanction. For example, the regularization of 74% of FDI in telecom, the announcement of a FAB policy, and shortly we will announce a policy for the Northeast, and other policy decisions which require no parliamentary approval. The executive and regulatory authorities seem to be moving forward. And finally, the media. It's no longer possible to say that the media has no role in shaping politics. The media is playing a very powerful role, and sometimes a disconcerting role. If pricing power returns to any section of industry, it brings to that industry also advertising power. It also brings to that industry lobbying power. And the media many of them today, corporates themselves, are inclined to play a very influential role in shaping policies, especially economic policy. And if you believe India today, the last issue, not the one that came out yesterday, but the one that came out a week ago, if you believe, and I'm quoting India today, even editorial space can be commercialized. Now, these are the elements which determine politics, and as I've defined the new economy, the question is politics overtaking the new economy? My answer is, the politics shaped by these forces has clearly overshadowed economic reforms. As one put in a position to carry out economic reforms, I do not say that we are overwhelmed or that we feel that we have been defeated. But clearly, the new politics has overshadowed the new economy. One has to work with regional parties and convince them that the path that we have taken or the policy that we have proposed is right, not only for the country as a whole, but for that state in particular. Sometimes this is an impossible task. What is good for the whole country may not necessarily be good for that state, or may not be as good for that state. So working with regional parties and spending one's political capital to convince regional parties that what is good for the country is also good for the state does take a toll on reform. And then you bring it into a system of government, the cabinet system of government, when one has to work with a coalition. Having convinced the political parties, and one has to convince the coalition partners, because some political parties are part of the coalition, some are outside the coalition. One has to convince the coalition partners that the policy that is being proposed is good for the whole country, good for the state which is represented by the political party whose representative is part of the coalition government. And that also takes a toll on reform. When these policies are translated into legislation, or an attempt is made to translate them into legislation, more compromises have to be made. For example, we had a small and medium industries bill. The bill was intended to free small and medium industry from the Inspector Raj. The original bill removed from the scope of many laws, many intrusive laws, small and medium industries. In fact, if the original bill had been passed into law, it would have virtually removed Inspector Raj from small and medium industry, especially small scale industry. But as the bill was passed in Parliament, many of the provisions were amended or watered down. The Inspector Raj still remains for small and medium enterprises, for small and medium industry. So the intended objectives are not fully carried out by legislation. In Parliament, we have to make too many compromises. Now add to that the fact that Parliament rarely debates bills these days. So there's hardly any scope to convince anyone of what is right and what is wrong. The deliberative exercise that Parliament is supposed to carry out has fallen by the wayside. I can give you any number of examples of bills which have been passed amidst shouting and confusion. In fact, I wonder whether at some stage someone will not ask the question whether these laws have been passed correctly or not, whether this is the constitutional way to make a law. There is, of course, a constitutional provision which says that if the Speaker certifies that a bill has been passed, no one can ask questions about the procedure adopted to pass the bill. But surely someday civil society will raise its voice and ask, is this law as we intended law to be made? Can you make law without debate? Can you make law amongst din and bustle? Is that law? Thankfully, the inability of Parliament to make laws does not affect executive to go forward and the regulatory authorities to go forward. Thankfully, our regulatory authorities seem to have matured and they are willing to take the process forward. And in this regard, I wish to cite at least a few regulatory authorities who are taking the process of reform forward. TRAI is one, the Telecom Regulatory Authority. SEBI is another. These are two regulatory authorities who have matured and who are willing to take the reform process forward. There are other regulatory authorities which are not as effective. For example, the electricity regulator in the states, or even the central electricity regulator, is not as effective. The port authority's mandate is very limited. It only regulates tariffs. We don't yet have a regulator in the field of competition. We don't have a regulator in petroleum and natural gas. We don't have a regulator in the transport sector. But the sooner we place these regulators, perhaps there is a chance that in that sector of the economy, the regulator can take the reform process forward. The PFRDA now, despite the fact that the PFRDA bill has not been passed, is attempting to take the process forward by taking steps to appoint the central record-keeping agency and to appoint pension fund managers. Executive also, whenever it finds it has the space and the freedom to act, is acting. Where it does not require legislative support, the executive is acting. Sometimes it's acting too slowly for one's satisfaction, but at least the executive is taking the process forward. And finally, the role of the media. The media is now becoming, or claiming to become, an important player in shaping economic policy. Now, the media is truly free and is simply a forum to debate economic policy. That would be the most welcome development. We must have newspapers which passionately advocate a leftist cause. We must have newspapers and magazines which passionately advocate the open economy. We must have magazines which highlight the plight of the very poor, especially the rural poor, the underprivileged. We must have a variety of newspapers and magazines. And to places where the print media cannot go, what better instrument than the camera? I think the camera today is a very powerful instrument, a powerful tool to stir debate and to expose inadequacies, inefficiencies, corruption. But can the media adopt policy positions and use the power to take forward those policy positions? Because most people, most other players tend to be overwhelmed by what the media writes and speaks about. And it's possible that the power of the media, the powerful influence it exerts upon the viewer, the reader, can, and I'm only hinting at this possibility, can suppress genuine debate. I think it's important that the media keeps the distinction between presenting news and fostering debate, and the distinction between presenting news and editorializing. when the lines between these three functions get blurred, as I find they are increasingly getting blurred, the power of the media has perhaps unintended effect of suppressing genuine debate in society. And it has also perhaps the unintended effect of prejudicing many causes and perhaps even in some cases interfering with the rights and privileges of individual citizens. For example, a media overkill on a crime can virtually pronounce a person guilty or innocent. I think the media must recognize its power and must therefore voluntarily place limitations on how it presents news, how it fosters debate, and how it will take a position in the editorial columns. Now, taking all this together, has the new politics overtaken the new economy? Well, thankfully not. If it did, we would not have 9% growth. The economy continues to move at a brisk pace thanks to the entrepreneurial skills and energies of our people, farmers, workers, entrepreneurs, businessmen, service providers. The young generation of India today is driven by the desire to create wealth, driven by the desire to make the globe its market, and that is what is driving India's economy. Inventiveness, innovation, entrepreneurial skills, and risk-taking is driving India's economy. I do not think any political factor can ever overwhelm that force. It sometimes can overshadow that force, but I don't believe it can at any time overwhelm or overtake that force. The force that is driving India is young India, the entrepreneurial spirit of India, the inventiveness and innovation of our young men and women and our business persons and service providers. That, I believe, cannot be overwhelmed or overtaken by anyone. What the new politics can do is definitely slow down the process. It can certainly impact adversely the new economy. If the politics turns out to be good politics, forward-looking politics, it's possible to take the economy to a higher plane. For example, the current debate is about whether we can sustain 9% growth. I'm convinced that if good politics supports good economic theory, it's possible to raise the level of growth to 10% and more. Our growth is today stunted by the fact that our politics is not serving the purposes of growth. Yes, sometimes it puts a check on governmental callousness or governmental neglect of sections of society. That's a welcome check. That's a function which politics must play if we neglect the physically challenged, if we neglect women, if we neglect the tribal people, if we neglect the scheduled castes, if we neglect those who do not even have a patch of land. Surely politics must command us to pay attention to those sectors. That is the functional role of politics. But the dysfunctional role of politics is to impact growth by either wrong policies or holding back the right policies. Today we are in a junction where, while I would say that the check on governmental neglect and governmental inefficiency and governmental callousness is a welcome check, politics is not supportive of good economics which can drive India's growth rate to a level higher than the 9% growth rate that we seem to enjoy today. The 9% growth rate must be sustained, must be raised to 10%. That would require good politics. That would require forward-looking politics. That would require our regional parties to acquire a national outlook. That would require coalition partners to make compromises, give up on ideological positions and make compromises so that policies can be taken forward. That would require Parliament to make laws, pass the laws which are pending for months and years. That would require the executive to be proactive and not abdicate its role and responsibilities in favor of any other organ. That would require regulatory agencies to mature very quickly. And that would also require the media to understand and therefore place voluntary limitations on its enormous power. End of the day, of course, I'm confident that eventually the new economy will triumph and the forces that are driving the new economy will indeed triumph. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Finance Minister. You set the platform for a debate, a much needed debate which is not happening in other forum where we elect and people send people to. As a journalist for 23 years, I must take up for the media and say that it is perhaps the only forum where debate is happening. And as evidence, I would say that in June 2005, the SEZ policy was set up. There were 13 GOM meetings, but the real issues of the SEZ were discussed outside Parliament and outside legislature, sir. There's a brief point on it. I open the floor now for questions. Please raise your hand, identify yourselves, and try and ask a question. Yes, the gentleman here, please.
Mr. Chidambaram, this is Nitin Sareen, and I'm engaged in my own chocolate manufacturing homemade business, homemade chocolate manufacturing. You see, if in India, if anybody wants to survive, whether to take example of a politician or a businessman, anybody, any MNC, you have to cater to mass market. You have to take due consideration of the requirements of a common man. And on one side, I see that take the latest example of Nandigram and the POSCO project. POSCO problem with POSCO is that it is facing a problem of land acquisition. So you have dual responsibility. On one side, you have the responsibility to lure foreign investment, thereby to help the economy grow. And on the other hand, you have to take care of the consent of the left parties and of the common man. Because these are the actually people who help in electing a new government. Everything is being controlled by them. So I want to know how you strike the balance between both of them.
How do you do the balancing act of balancing the electoral dividend and the corporate dividend?
Well, I thought I tried to explain. It's not easy because the current state of politics, the very large number of regional parties in a coalition or supporting a coalition have necessarily to defend their interests, their political interests, and their state's interests. And when they do so, they come into conflict with other regional parties or other coalition partners, or they come into conflict with sound economics. Therefore, the task of forging or weaving a policy out of these different strands of opinion is not an easy task. Take your SEZ policy. Now, the avowed policy of the West Bengal government is to promote industry. And we all know that industry requires land. But when they promote industry, and in this case, they are promoting private capital as well as foreign capital investment, which is a sign of the maturing of that political party. But they run into conflict with sections of their own people, and they run into conflict with those who espouse the interest of the classes that are affected. When you take land from farmers, you run into conflict with the owners of the farmland in your own state. You also run into conflict with civil society, which espouses the cause of the owners of the farmland. And then to weave a policy make a policy in this atmosphere is not very easy. It's all right for Mr. Shankarai to say the GOM did not resolve the issues of SEZ. It's the media which resolved the issues of SEZ.
Sir, I protest. I didn't say we resolved. We debated it. My limited point was that there was no debate.
Yeah. Perhaps the GOM should put out a newsletter at the end of every meeting.
It would have transparency.
We also debate. But the point is, no GOM, no cabinet can share its debates with the people. We can only share the conclusion. And it's not easy to reach a conclusion when there are so many interests clashing with each other. When we reach a conclusion, we shall certainly share it. When we reached a conclusion about, say, the FAB policy, we shared it with the people. When we reached a conclusion about merging Indian Airlines and Air India, we shared it with the people. But we are unable to reach a conclusion yet on the SEZ policy. And what do we share? No GOM, no cabinet can come and tell the world, we have debated, we have not come to a conclusion. We can only share a conclusion. But I think one must show a great deal of empathy for the political process that we are working today. This is a new process. And this is a very difficult process. It's only when you are part of the process, you know how difficult it is to work this process.
Mr. Khurakiwala.
Sir, you mentioned in one of your 5 major agenda the inclusive growth. And we have seen the benefit of economic liberalization over the last 15 years. And in your budget, I think for the first time we saw a great emphasis on education, health, agriculture, rural development in terms of providing the funding and the provision for the same. And I think there is also another aspect that the way economic liberalization have taken place in terms of policy changes, in terms of the structure, I think in the social sector, there has not been any change in this country for the last 40 or 50 years significantly in the structure and the policy. And I think if we have to bring about the ongoing inclusive growth, you have taken some initiative with the ITIs, but I think many other areas where government-public partnership or public-private partnership or the structural issues where to establish a school. For example, morning paper suggested in Haryana there are about 25 lakh students who have been going to school and because they did not follow certain rules and there is the schools will be closed down. I think, therefore, we would like to suggest that the government need to look at the structural reforms even in the social sector. Your comments, sir.
You see, when you talk about government, I assume you talk about central government, state government, and municipal government. Many of these issues cannot be addressed by the central government. Many of these issues have to be addressed at the state level and at the sub-state level. Where the issues are being addressed at the state and sub-state level, there is tangible progress. Why are poverty proportions very different from state to state? Why are literacy figures different from state to state? Why is infant mortality rate and maternal mortality rate widely different among the states? It is because at the state level and sub-state level, these issues have either been addressed or not addressed. To ask the central government to take responsibility to address these issues is asking the central government to do the impossible. Let's take literacy and education. How is it that Kerala achieves 100% literacy? And why is it that a state like UP still has 1 million children every year who attain the age of 5 years and do not enter a class? 1 million children every year in the state of Uttar Pradesh do not enter school. So I think these are issues which have to be addressed at the state level, sub-state level. The only way is to improve the quality of governance. People must hold those whom they elect to govern accountable. If they don't hold them accountable, how will governance improve? There's no question that governance has improved in many states where there was poor governance. But there are still large areas of country which are very poorly governed at the state level and more importantly at the sub-state level. In fact, we have not paid enough attention to district administration. That is the cutting edge of governance. If you can deliver a sound school system, a sound system of primary health centers, a sound system for distributing drinking water, building connecting roads at the district level, not only will the quality of life improve for people, but there will be so much economic activity generated by this that India's growth rate can be propelled to a higher plane. Therefore, we must ask ourselves the question, what is the quality of people we are electing at sub-state and state level, and not only look at Parliament and the government of India. There's so much to be done at the state level and the sub-state level.
We won't keep you away from your lunch for very long, so I'm going to take the call and two final questions. The gentleman here, Mr. Bajaj here.
I'm Nitin Shukla. Sir, do you think we need to take a fresh look at central, state and concurrent list of subjects to ensure accelerated and inclusive growth, particularly since the list was drawn 50-60 years back and probably it needs a fresh look?
See, there are two contrary pulls today in the polity. One section believes that since states are neglecting their responsibilities, the center must take over more and more responsibility in that area. Example, primary education, primary health care. These are subjects which always were entirely within the state jurisdiction. But today we have Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, we have the midday meal scheme, we have the NRHM, all driven by the center, because after patiently putting up with state neglect, civil society is demanding, and sections of the polity are demanding, that the center take over greater responsibility for these functions. The other strand of opinion is that the center has no business in these areas, and in fact the center should shed some of its responsibilities in favor of the state. For example, the states are demanding that the right to levy service tax must be taken away from the center and given to the states. The states are demanding that in many areas of governance, the center must wash its hands off, just hand over the money to the states, and the states must implement it. Now, I think that this debate has not reached a final conclusion. But over the last 10 years, my assessment is that more and more the debate is swinging in favor of those who want the center to play a more active role. In fact, every new program of the center, you will notice in the last 10 years, has been in areas which traditionally and constitutionally belong to the states. We are now taking over even rural electrification. The Rajiv Gandhi Vidyutikaran Yojana is rural electrification. NRHM is basic medical care through a trained health worker in the village. Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Take midday meal scheme. The midday meal scheme was introduced by Kamaraj in Tamil Nadu when there was no question of the center playing any role. Entirely designed, funded and implemented by a state government. Today the entire midday meal scheme is driven by the central government. I don't know how the center will be able to manage all these responsibilities, but if you ask civil society, they will tell you that since the states have neglected it, it is now the duty of the center to take over these responsibilities.
Mr. Bajaj and Mr. Amarnath.
Mr. Finance Minister, we recognize the reality of the coalition politics. But what we are concerned about is that while the majority cannot suppress or ignore the minority partners, the minority cannot ignore or suppress the majority. And, we find, and our perception is that the tail is wagging the dog and not the other way around. And especially when the chief minister of the minority body seems to be in consonance with the three aces we consider, the PM, you, and the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. So we have tremendous hopes. And can industry help you in this? Thank you.
Do you want to join the coalition?
Well, certainly industry can help. It stops complaining about a little tweaking of a tax rate here or a tax rate there.
Can you ask for it? Mr. Amarnath, the last question.
Industry is doing well. I've repeatedly said it. Industry is doing well, and let me offer once again my congratulations to industry. The service sector is doing well. Let me offer my congratulations to the service sector. You are able to attract investment. You are able to attract technology. You are inventive. You are innovative. You are willing to break with tradition and experiment with new forms of corporate governance. Families are willing to shed their responsibilities and hand over to professional managers. All this is a sign of industry maturing, and that maturing of industry is bringing huge profits and huge dividends to industry. You've earned it, keep it. But when government turns its attention to some sectors which have been neglected, they are our own people. And for that purpose, we need to raise some money. I think industry must willingly share that burden. No heavy burden has been put on industry. In fact, I've repeatedly said in privately, publicly, and within the cabinet, I'm betting on growth. And I'm betting on growth to be driven by industry and the services sector. Why would I do anything to affect growth? Without this growth, where is the question of inclusive growth? Without growth, where is the question of inclusive growth? And without growth, where is the question of funding inclusive growth? So I want industry to recognize that there are compulsions which require us to address sections of people who've been neglected. And when we do so, and we do increase the burden to some extent upon industry, industry must willingly bear that burden, number one. Number two, industry must also recognize that it has a role to play in macroeconomic stability. You can't look at only your balance sheets. I mean, around March 15, have a habit of looking at balance sheets. And I'm very happy to see the very healthy growth of balance sheets. However, beyond your balance sheet, you'll have to play a role in macroeconomic stability. The one thing that is affecting, or to some extent throwing a spanner in the works as far as macroeconomic stability, is core inflation. And I've said this before and I want to say this again. Please don't allow core inflation to be entrenched. In the last week for which we have figures, the rate of inflation for primary articles has moved down. The rate of inflation for fuel, power and lighting has moved down. The rate of inflation for the manufacturing sector is moving up. And therefore, it is in industry's interest, in the long-term interest of industry, to please pay some attention to the role you can play in macroeconomic stability. That's the best you can do. The best you can do is recognize that beyond your balance sheets, you have a role for macroeconomic stability. And if you will be kind to me a little more, that's the best role you can play.
Mr. Amarnath.
I'm Amarnath from Neemrana Hotels. While we try and do everything right as we can, and we are hugely appreciative of the 9% growth, what I think people here are they're not suggesting 9% growth without the government. but perhaps with a better government. And I think that in this case, the bureaucracy's role is very important, because they very often operate as if they were a law unto themselves. And when we are harassed, or when there is, they demand corruption of us and we don't back them, then everything comes to a standstill. So I've heard you say that we shouldn't encourage corruption, but if your electricity is cut, if you don't get licenses, what are you supposed to do? It's not just the 9%, I think it could be 15% also, if we have good governance and a bureaucracy that's answerable.
I think, I think it's unfair to paint the whole bureaucracy with the same brush. I think a bureaucracy is like a horse. A horse is as good as a rider. If you know to ride your horse, you can get things done. It's only when you don't know to ride a horse, I don't know if the horse takes you for a ride, I suppose.
So does the growth rate.
Yeah. Now, having said that, I recognize that we cannot cleanse the stables by simply a fiat or a diktat. That is why the government has given you means the citizen, powerful instruments to assert your rights. The Consumer Redressal Forum is extremely active these days. The Right to Information Act, public interest litigation. These are powerful instruments that are available to you under the law today to expose corruption, to expose inefficiency. It's the way you use these instruments. I would urge you to use these instruments to expose the bureaucracy, expose governance failures, and expose corruption. But I don't think we should plead helplessness. Today, individual in society is far more empowered than what an individual 20 years ago was. 20 years ago, could you have imagined an individual demanding information from government? Could you have imagined anyone going to a consumer forum and getting an award because his baggage was lost by an airline, or because some information was refused to him, or his passport was delayed? Today, I think individual is more empowered. But I think we should use this power to place a check on the bureaucracy and place a check on ministers and government.
Thank you. That was the last question. May I now invite Mr. Arun Puri, Editor-in-Chief of India Today Group, to come in.
Thank you very much, sir.